What's up, my fellow Terrans? It's Alan, and we're going to be continuing on with Grand Design Chapter 8. Lightning and fire crackled around the ship in a fulminous halo, then fell away into the midnight black of deep hyperspace. Ruar shuddered and unjacked, falling to rest on the Spartan metal deck of the bridge. "We're away," he reported, his voice incongruously steady despite panting heavily. "We should be at Aurelius in 5 hours or so." Anja smiled and bent down to scratch a vaguely offended Ruar behind the ears. "Good work," she said cheerily. Ruar looked too exhausted to object. Kiddick chittered and reclined in his seat. "I confess, I haven't heard of Aurelius before," he said, waving a tablet in one segmented arm. "Is it one of the defunct stations?" Jezri shook her head. "No, Aurelius was always just a waypoint. Some gas mining, but the system doesn't have much of note in it. Much of note in it. Jesus. It sits off the galactic plane a ways. So people would use it as a target to pop up over the Perseus arm." Ruar raised his head. "If there's no station, it's going to take a long time to get back. Even if there's a station straight planeward form. Even if there's a station straight planeward from Aurelius, we'd be spending weeks riding the bubble." He shuddered. "Longest no assist jump I ever did was 3 days, and it was pure straight hell." Anja laughed. "Don't worry, doggy. We'll have a much faster ride back." She giggled at the dark look Ruar cast her way. "Excuse me if I don't want to bet on a millennia-old ghost ship," he shot back. "You're not the one that gets to sit here for hours and hours if it doesn't work." Jezri frowned. She hadn't given much thought to the condition of the Grand Design prior to Anja rediscovering it. Not for many, many years. Fuck. Let me reread that. Jezri frowned. She hadn't given much thought to the condition of the Grand Design prior to Anja rediscovering it. Not for many, many years. The news that it had been hit by one or more gamma ray bursts was not encouraging. In the worst case scenario, the ship and its precious cargo would both be long dead, lost to the ravages of time and radiation. More than her own well-being, Jezri worried about Anja if that proved to be the case. Her sister had maintained her laser focus for so long that a sudden revelation like that would be, well, bad. The focus of her worries was currently waving off Ruar's concerns about the derelict ship. "It will be fine," said Anja. It will be fine," said Anja dismissively. "The Grand Design is a late-model Navy cruiser. The systems are quite resistant to radiation and are designed with multiple backups in case of a primary failure." Fuck. Jezri figured. Ruar nodded but didn't look convinced. Jezri figured he was remembering the rather degraded transit station they had just departed back in Harsi. Anja's points were sound, though she had to admit the only way to test her assertions was to wait and see. Jezri sighed. After 5,000 years, 5 hours shouldn't feel this long. They arrived in a splash of white light, Ruar's deft touch bringing them gently back to normal space. A dull red star glowered at them across a dusty band of rock and ice. To their right, the warm glow of a galactic disk hung like luminous thunderclouds in the distance. To the left, a vast sheet of black held a scattering of lonely stars shining weakly against the void of intergalactic space. They had arrived at Aurelius. Kedek peered out of the viewport appreciatively. Goodness, he rattled. I don't believe I've been this far off the plane before. That's quite a sight. Ruar shook himself as he stowed the shipjack again. We're going to be seeing it a lot. We're going to be seeing it a lot, unless you've got some way to narrow the field. I didn't see any obvious signal sources, and it's going to be a pain looking for anything with all this dust in the inner system. Anja grinned and produced a small black box from her pocket. This should help. The station logged the ship when it left, including the last IFF authentication update it received. She unspooled a cable and proffered it to Ruar. With the proper authorization code, which we now have, the ship will respond to a query with a type beam authenticate. With the proper authorization code, which we now have, the ship will respond to a query with a type beam authentication sent to our coordinates. Jesus, can't read for jack shit. Ruar's exoskeleton reached out and snagged the cable. He studied his console for a few seconds before selecting a port and connecting the box to the ship. That seems a little too easy, he grumbled. If that's all it takes, why didn't someone try it before? Jezri leaned forward and her brow knitting. If I remember correctly, there's a range limiter on the response. It also needs to have the correct authentication code. The codes for sensitive missions are changed for each leg of a long trip, and are only provided to the ship when it departs. Kiddick nodded. So to find the ship, someone would have to know which system to scan and obtain the correct code. Yeah, Jezri confirmed. For obvious reasons, security was a concern, so there are a number of restrictions. She hesitated. Also, the code will only work once. Ruar blinked. I mean, that makes sense, he said, but doesn't that hurt our chances? Andra shrugged. If it does not work, then we will adjust our strategy. For now, please send out. She leaned over and punched a few buttons on the console, then straightened up with a bright smile. There, she said cheerily. That configuration should work. Ruar stepped back and waved a hand at the console. Please, he said, be my guest. Once more, Anja leaned over to press the glowing panel. A low chime sounded, and she stood away from the console. Anja quickly clutched her hands together behind her back, but not before Jezri caught a slight tremble in her fingers. There, she said softly. Transmission sent. Ruar looked around at each of them, the silence on the bridge stretching out awkwardly. So, he said, what now? We wait, replied Jezri. Given the short range, it should be a quick... She cut off as the console chimed again, indicating a response. Anja dove towards it like a striking snake, nearly bowling over Ruar in her enthusiasm. Confirmed, she said, in her voice tight. It's in the dust belt on the near side of the star, about 5 million kilometers out. Ruar nodded and grabbed the jack. We can micro-jump close to those coordinates. I'll bring us in a bit away from the precise origin. He paused, flicking his ears nervously. You may want to buckle up for this one. What's the matter, ace pilot? Jezri needled as she grabbed for her harness. Feeling okay? Oh, fuck off, he retorted crossly. I like to see you make a millisecond tolerance jump into a gravity well. His arms finished securing his own restraints, plugged in the jack and stored themselves tightly against his legs. All right, he muttered. Hold on to your butts. The ship's engines thrummed as Ruar reoriented them for the jump, then shifted to a high-pitched whine as the drive charged. Tones layered across each Tones layered across each other, and a film of white light began to dance across the star field outside. Ripples distorted the angry red glare from the system's lone star, sending motes of fire scattering across the starscape. Ruar tensed, and the light wrapped around the ship like a constricting fist. A brief flash of familiar soap bubble starlight wrenched the viewports. Wreathed the viewport, sorry. The dull red star leapt towards them, the dust clouds around it gasping upwards to enclose them in an expanse of dim embers. The ship jolted violently, as if plunging into water. They slammed against their harness, eliciting a grunt of pain from Anja as her injured ribs hit the restraints. From the rear of the ship came a loud crash as something tore loose and tumbled across the hold. Jezreel's breath caught in her throat as a bear of deepest black jumped into view. It swiftly grew to become a gaping void in the red glow surrounding them. Kiddick shrilled a piercing note of alarm, his legs scrabbling reflexively against his seat as Ruar swore and veered the ship to the side. As their velocity dipped down to near zero, Kiddick slumped in his seat. "Mr. Ruar," he clacked irritably, "please try not to run my ship into any ancient derelicts that look like we came within meters of collision." Ruar was standing stock still with his mouth hanging slightly open. "Captain," he said haltingly, his ears flicking back and forth. "No, it's..." "Oh my," said Anja faintly, raising a shaking hand to her head. I can hear her. I can hear her. Hello, pretty girl." Kick chuckled Jezreel. "Take another look." The captain gave her a questioning glance, then peered out the viewport again. "I don't see what you're..." Anja flicked a hand at the ship. He paused. Oh, by Jim's dusty bones," he whispered, his voice filled with awe. At Anja's unspoken command, lights had flickered across the length of the ship. The illumination washed over its hull and brought it to the ship's true size into perspective. Nearly a kilometer of slate gray plating hung motionless in front of him, speckled by tiny viewports and cold white running lights. The ship's boxy frame tapered to a raked wedge as its bow, while the aft half flared wide on each side to accommodate the mammoth engine block. On the starboard bow, Grand Design was stenciled in large faded letters. Below it sat the triple starburst insignia of the Terran Navy. Jezreel felt a hot pressure in her chest looking at it. It had been a fixture every day of her young life, stenciled on her clothes and her belongings. Seeing it hanging there, even worn and obscured by years of abrasive dust and radiation, she could almost make herself believe that she was on the shuttle to her first assignment again, staring up in awe as they approached their berthing. She glanced at Anja. She too was staring up at the ship. Raptly, a look of bliss on her upturned face. This had been her dream every day since the Grand Design was first reported missing. For all of the emotions rushing through Jezreel, she could only imagine what Anja felt upon seeing the ship. The four of them sat spellbound for a moment. Anja found her voice first, walking over to Ruar and settling a hand on his back. "Take us below the ship," she said. "I'll open the door." The engines spooled up as they began to move, slowly gliding under the massive bulk of the ship. As they moved past the bow, Jezri could make out the edges of the armor plates, gigantic bands of metal stretching, pitted and scored over the underside of the hull. The low blisters of gun emplacements sat clustered on the edges and ridges, flanked by hummocks of sensor gear. Ahead of them, a thin line of light appeared on the hull. As they drew near it, it widened to show a cavernous docking bay beyond. The opening dwarfed their ship as they rose through it to enter the bay, sliding through the docking field with a subtle vibration and rush of atmosphere. Inside, dozens of berths lined the walls around a large central space stretching back hundreds of meters. Ruar twitched. "How fucking big is this thing?" he muttered, his ears flicking back as he pored over the feed of sensor input. "There's at least 3 other ships in here, and space for a fuck ton more." Anja nodded. "Most ships this size have few small shuttles, fighters, and fast attack craft. She says that half of her complement is on patrol. Complement, I don't know. So I assume they were lost in the attack." Okay, wait. Let me reread this. She says that half of her complement is on patrol, so I assume they were lost in the attack. She cocked her head. "She's asking for a birth registry. Does your ship have a name?" "The Leviathan," said Kiddick proudly. Jezri snorted, earning an acid look from all of Kiddick's eyes. "It's for advertising," the captain said crossly. "Besides, how many civilian ships do you know how many civilian ships do you know of that are bigger?" Is that a typo? I don't know. Anja gave him a pat on the head, and the captain knit his arms in irritation. "It's a good little ship," she said. "Berth 3? Ruar nodded as they settled down over a crisp numeral painted on the deck. A light wave of dust rippling up as they descended. Jezri slid free of her harness and stretched. "Okay," she said. "We got air?" "We got," Ruar said, tilting his head for a moment as he queried the sensors. "Oh yeah, you're good. How does that work anyway?" "I have to change the filters out on this thing every year or we can't breathe." "What sort of magical bullshit keeps air on the stations for that long?" Jezri gave him a look. "Well, on this ship nothing is taxing the filters because the whole crew is dead." Ruar looked abashed, but pressed the point. "What about the stations? People live there." "Not really," said Jezri, shaking her head. "The stations were designed to be inhabited to capacity, and the air systems can probably handle twice that." She looked over at Anja, who was developing an irritated tilt to her posture. "Let's table this for later," Jezri sighed. "It looks like Anja is about to chew her way through the hatch." Ruar blinked and the doors hissed open. A draft of cool, dry air snaked in through the door to the bridges, fresh and clean with the barest hint of ozone. A rush of memories crashed into Jezri's vision. Her 13 years old on her first visit to a real Navy ship, pushing her way through a crowd of her sisters to gawk at the reactors. The hangars, the bridge, her back from her first assignment, the crisp air of the hangar washing away the tang of smoke and blood that had crept into every corner of the shuttle. Her, years later, on a different ship, listening to a terse communique listing the worlds that had fallen silent. Anja had gone immediately to stand outside the ship, tilting her head back to take in the distant sweep of the hangar's ceiling. Jezri, Ruar, and Kiddick followed closely behind her, looking around the bay. Yeah, said Ruar, stretching. I stand by my initial assessment. Big fuck-off hangar. Anja flashed him a quick smile and set off up some stairs towards an exit. Jezri sighed and turned to the other two. Stay close to us, she said. I don't expect trouble, but we should limit our exploration until we've accessed the internal sensors. The three followed after Anja, but caught up to her only a short way past the exit door. A body stretched out on the floor in front of her, shrunken and brown, with its arms curled inwards against its torso. Faded gray rags wrapped around it. The occasional strip of stained gold piping, the only hint that it had once been a naval uniform. Excuse me. Ruar looked down the corridor and saw more bodies slumped against the walls or sprawled across the floor. There's so many of them, he said, uneasily backing away. Jezri nodded sadly. More than just these. Crew for a ship this size would be in the thousands. She walked over to look more closely at the body. It was a male, and the corroded pips by its neck indicated a rank of lieutenant. Anja straightened up. We can deal with them after we have secured the ship, she said reluctantly. The lift will be farther aft. She began walking again, her stride determined, but she could not keep her gaze from straying to each fallen form as she passed. Jezri also found her eyes drawn to the desiccated corpses. Each one was a former comrade, humans who had been about their normal routine, unaware that they had seconds to live. Kiddick and Ruar tailed the women closely. If they had been disinclined to risk becoming lost before, the eerie bodies had removed any remaining desire to explore. Ruar kept his eyes up from the floor, focusing on the neatly spaced numbered doors and counting the differences from the standard civilian models he was used to. One door wasn't numbered. Ruar paused and dredged up his recollection of written English, but he couldn't make sense of the label. Hey guys, he called out. Anja and Jezri glanced over from where they had been studying a chunk of corroded metal clasped in a mummified hand. What does Valkyrie mean? Their heads snapped up to stare at Ruar so quickly that Kiddick flinched back in alarm. Where did you see that word? Anja asked quietly. Her face was expressionless, but her eyes set every bit of Ruar's fur on end. He managed, pointing towards the door. Jezri stalked over to the door, staring wide-eyed at the label. She turned to Anja. There was a deployment here? She asked, incredulously. Did you know about that? Not a thing, said Anja, coming over to stand beside Jezri. But they would often keep sensitive deployments off the official listings. She reached towards the door, pausing with her hand an inch away from the controls. Jezri put a hand on Anja's shoulder, and the two shared a look for a moment before Anja placed her hand on the panel. A wash of light appeared over Anja's hand, moving across it methodically before receding into the panel. A chirrup sounded, and the door hissed open. Beyond it lay a long hallway with several large doors along the walls. The two women walked inside. Moving quickly past two doors and stopping in front of a third. They shared another look, then opened the door and disappeared within. Kiddick and Ruar shared a look, but waited outside. Their sudden reaction to the room had been alarming. Had been an alarming reminder of how dangerous their companions were, and how little they knew about them. After a long minute, Jesri walked out of the room, her lips a thin line. She looked at them expressionlessly. Expressionlessly. Her eyes her eyes like dull chips of ice. Ruar shivered. Ruar shivered. Jesri breathed out, her shoulders sagging, and seemed to notice Ruar and Kiddick for the first time. She shook her head and waved them inside. "Sorry," she said. Didn't mean to be. Didn't mean to be strange. We were just a bit startled." She waited until they drew closer, then continued, her voice soft and flat. Valkyrie was a special unit of the naval. Valkyrie was a special unit of the Naval Marines. She explained. They used a blend of biotechnology and cybernetics to make enhanced soldiers. They deployed them for espionage, strike missions, extractions, and to oversee sensitive operations like this one. Ruar tilted his head, confused, but then realization struck him. "Your unit," he said. Kiddick rattled his mandibles quietly. "Our sisters," Anja replied, from past the door. Ruar moved further to see inside and saw her standing in Spartan living quarters, cradling a body in her arms. Its skin was dried and pale brown, better preserved than the corpses outside, but very clearly dead. On its head, the remnants of a thick braid still showed a clear red hue. "This is Hannah," she said, her voice forced and harsh. Jesri caught Ruar's eye and waved him past the door. He and Kiddick took the hint. Moving farther down the hall, Jesri said something quietly to Anja and slid the door closed, walking over to join them. "Leave her there for a bit," she said quietly. "Let's look through the other rooms." The other living quarters across the hall proved to be empty, with bed sheets folded nearly over a thin cot. Jesri stepped in and looked around, feeling a pang of remembrance. She had spent most of her military career living in rooms like these, the same dimensions and furniture no matter how far-flung the posting. She sighed and moved on to the next room. Racks and shelves of equipment lined its walls, festooned with dust-covered guns, knives, swords, and grenades, and all manner of tiny electronic devices. Their innocuous appearance made all the more sinister by their company. Jesri slid the door closed again, earning an indignant look from Ruar. "We're not going to check that out?" he asked disbelievingly. Jesri gave him a faint smile. "You don't want to waste your time there." At his questioning look, she moved across the hall and opened the door opposite from the armory, revealing a dimly lit room that bent away to the left. Curious, Ruar trotted over and struck his head around the corner. 3 meters tall and shining like a frozen quicksilver, four full suits of powered armor sat in evenly spaced alcoves along the far wall of the room. White and black plating framed the metallic skin like a latticed shell across the chest and shoulders. The helmet had a smooth white faceplate with a gray triple starburst covering the front. The digitigrade. I'm not sure. I've never seen this word. Digitigrade. I don't know. They're digitigrade. Legs spread wide and at the legs. Their digigrade legs spread wide at the foot. Smooth plating stretching up midway to dissolve into a latticework that meshed neatly with the chest armor. The arms hung loosely, fingers uncurled to show the metal supports running throughout. Across the room, each suit had a set of equipment, a rifle the size of a Ruar with an underbarrel launcher, and a matte white sword with a straight blade tapering to a sharply angled tip. Ruar stood transfixed, a high whine escaping from his throat, while Kiddick's eyes flickered rapidly across the equipment. Jezri walked up and ran a hand over the lattice chess piece, hooking her fingers on the armored ridges. "I wasn't expecting to find a Valkyrie armory here," she said, "but I'm glad we did. With an intact and fully charged suit, we can hold our own against pretty much anything." Kiddick chittered, finding his voice. "Madam Jezri, I don't believe force will be necessary. I can't picture the scenario where you show up in a kilometer-long ancient human warship, step onto the dock wearing this armor, find the inhabitants anything but friendly and willing to please." Jezri flashed Kiddick a grin. "Only if they're smart," she retorted playfully. "In my experience, looking threatening only gets you halfway there. You have to be threatening as well." She stepped back and glanced at the oversized weapon. "Not that I have any plans to pick a fight. Once we've secured the ship and located the weapon, we should be able to move self-sufficiently from there." Ruar tore his gaze away from the shining armor and looked back towards the hall. "There was one more door at the end. What's in there?" Jezri laughed. "Nothing else exciting, I'm afraid. That's the briefing room." She paused, and a cloud slipped over her features. We should look, though," she muttered, drawing curious glances from the other two. Jezri had been opening each door with trepidation, new word, trepidation as they proceeded, her anxiety growing each time. It was inescapable. Valkyrie teams were always deployed in pairs. She walked quickly over to the door, keying it open. Her face was lined, and she sank unconsciously back towards into a ready stance. When the door opened, however, she saw only what she knew must be present. A long wooden table, some scattered chairs, a large display, and a small figure with the long black hair lying prone on the ground. Jezri walked over to the corpse. When Ruar had found the Valkyrie section, she resigned herself to finding more of her dead sisters. When Anja had found Hannah lying in her quarters, it had stripped away a sliver of hope that they might not have been aboard. As Jezri gently turned the body over to see the dry, shriveled features of her sister Tessa, there was nothing left to feel. Perhaps a slight sense of grim relief as she discovered finally what had become her wayward sibling. There were only a handful of Valkyrie left that Jezri had not seen since before the attacks, and she had long since given them up for dead. Anja kept in contact with those few left alive, but it had been a long, long time since anyone but Jezri spoke with her. Jezri's assumption for millennia had been that Anja was her last living sister. It didn't make seeing proof any easier. She turned back to Anja, standing behind Kiddick and Ruar, looking over at the body. "Tessa?" she asked quietly. Jezri nodded, and Anja closed her eyes. After a moment, she reopened them and set her shoulders. "Let's continue to the bridge." They exited into the hall, and continued towards the lift, walking together along the silent passageway. The four took a lift up and over to deck. The four took a lift up and over to deck 1, aft, where the main bridge was located. The lift exited directly into the ops area. Rows of consoles lit up, displaying systems information in a kaleidoscope of dancing lines and numbers. A few bodies sprawled on the floor, but the bridge was largely empty. An elevated daze held dry held duty stations for the captain, first officer, and pilot. Okay, let me reread this sentence. Okay, in elevated days held duty stations for the captain, first officers, and pilot. Huge viewports swept along the outer edge, allowing a splendid view of the Aurelian dust clouds and tinting the whole room with a bloody red glow. Why is everything so big? Grumbled Kiddick, his eyes flicking around the room. Humans weren't that tall. You could park my ship in here. Jezri held up a finger. The first and only driving principle of human engineering, because it's awesome. Kiddick buzzed, his arms flailing in exasperation. But it's not practical. Exposed viewports, unreachably high bulkheads, right on the surface of the ship. I thought this was supposed to be a military vessel. Anja giggled. Silly bug. We have a practical bridge too, of course. It's backed by the Valkyrie section. We have a practical bridge too, of course. It's backed by the Valkyrie section, amidships encased in armor plating. That was the war bridge. And probably the one they were using for their mission. This was the bridge for convincing people they shouldn't fight us. She flounced up the stairs to the command days and leapt into the captain's chair, pressing controls on the armrest. Ruar glanced around the bridge, taking in the metal beams above. Makes sense. Something just feels right about being able to see outside. That said, he trailed off, indicating the rows of ops panels with a sweep of his exoskeletal arm. How are we going to manage all this with just the four of us? Jezri gave him a puzzled look. We don't need most of that with a shipjack. And Anja said you hadn't agreed to fly. Didn't you want to? Ruar gaped back at her. I thought she was joking. You'd let me fly the ship? Well, sure, said Jezri. You're the only one of us who's a pilot. She stretched her arms. You'll need to see the captain first, though. Ruar looked over to Kiddick, who shook his head and looked at Jezri. Jezri winked and pointed behind them. They both looked back bemusedly at Anja, who waved to them from the command chair. Hi, so I can only release flight functions to a crew member, she said. She said cheerfully. If you want to fly the ship, I will need to give you a field commission. We decided earlier to extend both of you the offer, if you wanted to stick around. Ruar and Kiddick shared a glance. The Hitt gave him a passable shrug and nodded, and they both turned back to Anja. We're in, said Ruar. What do we do? Anja stood. Raise your right hand, she said, all lividity gone from her voice. Ruar sat back and raised a paw, while Kiddick lifted his primary forelimb. Do you swear to support and defend the rights of all living beings to life, liberty, and self-determination, and to bear true faith and allegiance to the Terran Federation? Anja looked them over with steely expectation. Jezri leaned in and whispered, I so swear. I so swear, Ruar, and Kiddick said. Anja nodded. Do you swear to obey the lawful orders of the Terran Command and their designates, to serve as the bulwark and grantor, Guarantor, I don't know how you fucking say that word. Guarantor of freedom for all whom you encounter. I so swear, they replied. Anja's steel face softened, but her voice rang out hard and clear through the empty bridge. Then by the power vested in me by the Terran command, I hereby award you the field commission of ensign. She broke into a smile. May you discharge your duties with honor and pride. They stood still for a moment, Anja beaming at them before Ruar craned his neck to look around. He said awkwardly. Now what? Jezri laughed. Now you can fly the ship. Go ahead. There should be a standard shipjack at the pilot station. She motioned up to the console at Anja's left hand. Be nice to my girl, Anja said, the ominous tone of her voice somewhat spoiled by her smirk. Ruar climbed to the dais and grabbed the shipjack with his exoskeleton, slotting it eagerly into the data port on his neck. So, he asked, is there any sort of authentication or... Ruar froze, twitched once, and stared, screaming a high, thin wail of pain. And that's chapter 8. Thanks for watching.